Okay, so today's lecture is called Punk Britain, and it's basically about the final forms of collapse of the social democratic system of the post-war period that happens, as you'll see from this lecture, from the late 60s through the 1970s. And it's going to end on the bombshell of comparing Margaret Thatcher and Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. As we finally buried the old bag yesterday, I think it will be the first time that you've heard anyone describe her as a punk. So this is my ambition for today's lecture. Okay, so this is, as I said, the last in this series of lectures that looks at the challenges to and the fracturing of social democracy in the post-war period. It's trying to explain how that system, which arguably delivered and achieved so much, lasted for such a very short time, which is why I call it the brief life of social democracy. Now, we've seen, and I've been at pains to emphasize, that in many ways the undoing of social democracy had its roots in earlier decades than the 1970s. They lay in the compromised delivery of the forms of welfare established because of the fiscal crisis that plagued Britain after the Second World War. It lay in the technocratic, not participatory nature of the project. It lay in the new forms of affluence and the reconfiguration of class that occurred in the 1950s and the 1960s. It lay in the end of the empire and the increasing diversity of the population and the debates about who welfare should belong to. And it lay finally in the criticisms of the limited nature or of the universality, of the claims to universality that we saw emerging from the youth culture and politics in the 1960s and the 1970s. I'm not today going to suggest that the 1970s was the final nail in the coffin of social democracy. What I am going to suggest to you today was that it was, in some sense, the beginning of its very end. And again, I'm going to be emphasizing that the crisis of the 1970s, insofar as there was a crisis, was a global economic one, a global economic crisis that all countries in the world suffered from. There was the collapse of the regulation of the currency system through the Bretton Woods system. Most currencies were floated in the period between 1968 and 1971. In the mounting budget and trade deficits that occurred in the following years, of the oil crisis in 1973 when there was an Arab oil embargo in response to the US support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and the widespread experience of so-called stagflation. All of this led to the deregulation of money and currency markets and the rise of a new critique of the Keynesian forms of management of economic life that had predominated since the 1940s. But I'm also going to be suggesting to you again today that there was a specific type of flavour to this crisis in Britain during the 70s. And that had a number of characteristics to it. The first was, of course, that this marked the final collapse of the last vestige of Britain's imperial economy. It wasn't just the Bretton Woods system that collapsed in the late 60s and early 70s. It was the sterling area, which you'll remember had been created in 1931 to prop up the value of the pound, despite a series of devaluations of it during, from the 1940s through to the late 1960s. Another specifically British element of it was the growing national obsession with decline, with the idea of decline that historians now term declinism. This took several forms. Contemporaries thought of Britain as suffering decline in a number of different ways. Its world in the role was declining as the empire had been lost and Britain was trying to reconceive of itself as a European, as a part of the European project. There was an obsession with Britain's relative economic underperformance that was often equated to a sense of economic decline, that Britain's economy was becoming less and less significant in the global, on the global stage. There was the sense of moral decline that I talked about on Tuesday, which was associated with the growing attack on the 1960s and the permissive legislation that it was seen to have unleashed. And finally, there was a sense of a political crisis, or a sense of the decline of the political system in Britain, both in terms of the seemingly growing apathy of the electorate to turn out to vote in elections, but also, rather as in the 1920s and the 1930s, a very broad sense that the party political parliamentary system had failed to resolve these important structural problems that Britain was experiencing. And then finally, there was an obsession with the labour movement, and in particularly the role of trade unions and the role that trade unions had played within the mixed economy of the social democratic system. Arguably, the trade unions in Britain had never been as fully incorporated into economic life as they had been in Germany after the Second World War. But of course, they were far more central than, for instance, the unions played, played a more central role than the unions played in the US in the post-war period. What we see in the 1970s is an increasing critique of the role of unions in ways that had been unimaginable 20 or 30 years earlier, when they were seen as a central pillar of economic management of the mixed economy. And all of this ends up culminating, I'm going to suggest, in the formation of punk in the middle of the 1970s, from 1976 to 1978, and the election of Mrs. Thatcher as the leader of the Conservative Party, and her eventual election as Prime Minister in 1979. There was, I'm going to be suggesting, a sense that just as the Sex Pistols were singing, there was anarchy in the UK, and it required some sense of new authoritarian or anarchic response to it. So I'm going to talk to you today basically in these three different sections. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about how important the politics of race and nation were to the growing political instability of the country. I'm then going to talk to you about the new forms of economic ideas and economic policies that developed in the 1970s. And then finally, I'll end up by being as mean to Mrs. Thatcher as I can possibly make myself in a balanced, scholarly way. And when I talk about the politics of race and nation, I'm going to do this basically in three sections, because I think there are three quite connected but nonetheless separate elements to it. The first is the debate about immigration and race relations and what becomes known as multiculturalism. and the criticisms that develop around that. The second is the politics of Northern Ireland. That, remember, we saw the beginning of the civil rights movement there in 1967, 1968, and that situation degenerates very quickly into one of armed conflict. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about the process of devolution in Scotland and Wales, where Scotland and Wales are trying increasingly to break away from the English state, or to find new forms of self-government. So in all of these sections, what I'm basically trying to say is that the very fabric of the nation that had been long established since the Act of Union of 1801, remember, which is the act that creates the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the union of the nation is beginning to crumble and fall apart. So let me start with immigration. Now, the first thing I want to say here is that immigration had been going on for centuries, as you already know, in Britain, but it only becomes problematic at very specific moments. It's rather like the endless rediscovery of poverty. Keeps on occurring at very specific moments. So the question of immigration becomes politically explosive at particular times. So remember the debates about, for instance, Jewish immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century. Remember the concerns that I was talking to you about immigration from the Caribbean and from India and Pakistan in the late 40s and early 50s. Now we have, in the 1960s, a return of the visibility of those issues. And it has really very little to do with numbers of people. As I say here, emigration from the UK continues to exceed those for immigration in the period from 1945 to 1979. And you can see that in the 1960s and through to the 1970s, the percentage of so-called foreign-born population in the UK is remarkably small. Just 0.2% of the population have been born in the Commonwealth. And that rose to 1.2% in 1970 in England, as opposed to the United Kingdom as a whole. That figure was 1.2%. By 1971, that had risen to a figure of 6.6%, although that is the population of all people born outside the UK, not just across the former empire, now known as the Commonwealth. It's also true, as I said before, that there were particular pockets, particularly in London, the North West and the Midlands, where the population of migrants were much higher. In London, some wards or parishes had was populated by people of colour by as much as 20%. In Wolverhampton, it was 5% in the middle of the 1960s. Even by 1991, though, when only 5.5% of the population is now designated an ethnic minority, which is the new category that was being used then, 30% of London's population fell under that heading. So what I'm trying to say here is that even though the percentage of so-called ethnic minorities had risen to 1.2% in 1971, by 1991 it was still under 6% of the total population, even if there were particular areas of concentration within specific geographical areas. Nonetheless, as I'm trying to suggest to you, even though the numbers weren't huge, immigration begins to be seen as really problematic in new types of ways. And you see this, I think, most clearly in the growth of a new type of English nationalism. A new type of English nationalism that takes new political forms with the creation of the Organisation of the National Front and the British movement in 1967 and 1968, both concerned to introduce schemes of forced repatriation of non-white people. Now, part of how this becomes increasingly contentious was about the effects of decolonisation, and particularly new policies that were being adopted in newly independent states like Kenya and Uganda, who were undergoing policies to Africanize their populations by expelling their Asian populations, most of whom were South Asians who had been who had arrived in those countries as indentured labourers during the late 19th or 20th century. The Kenyan Asians came first between 1964 and 1968, when some 20,000 of them arrived in Britain. And it was this sense of a new specific group of people coming that set off the fears of a so-called new wave of immigrants. As that flow of people dried up, the Ugandan Asians followed as Idi Amin began a policy of forced expulsion. And from 1968 to 1972, the Ugandan Asians arrived in Britain. There were in these times attempts to try and think, and this is a very old story in Britain, but there were attempts of trying to figure out ways in which these populations could be resettled in what was left of the British Empire. So there really were serious discussions about whether these populations could be sent to the Falkland Islands, which, as you know, was still part of the British Empire and had a climate that everyone would enjoy. The 1968 Immigration Act, which, remember, follows on the heels of the 1962 Immigration Act and the Race Relations Act of 1965, basically was a much more restrictive piece of legislation, restricting entry only to those people with fathers or grandfathers born in the United Kingdom. I don't think you need to see these figures. Okay, so into this mix steps the figure of Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell was an intellectually brilliant Conservative member of Parliament. He was a classicist at the University of Cambridge. We've come across him once before because alongside Barbara Castle, he, remember, denounced the treatment of the repression of the Mau Mau in Kenya in the middle of the 1950s. And during the late 1950s, he becomes Assistant Secretary at the Treasury and becomes increasingly influential in the development of conservative economic thought at that time. In the early 1960s, he becomes Minister of Health in the final days of the final years of the Conservative government. And by the middle of the 1960s, he's widely regarded as a future leader of the Conservative Party, indeed possibly even the next leader of the Conservative Party. All the more fascinating then that in 1968 he makes a speech which became the defining speech of his political career. He made a speech which basically shattered the cross-party consensus that the issue of immigration should be not openly debated, that it was a too contentious area and that politicians had to be very careful about inciting forms of racial hostility or even racial hatred. This speech became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. And what it does is did two key things. First of all, Powell rejects the idea that Britain has an obligation to its former imperial subjects. Indeed, he says, quite unusually for a Conservative politician, that the empire had been a dreadful mistake, and Britain should not think that it has ties of obligation to its former imperial subjects. The other thing that Powell does is to argue against the prevailing tide that was seen very clearly in the Race Relations Act of 1965 of cultural assimilation. He develops what some people have called a new type of racism, saying that racism wasn't about biological differences, it was actually about unbridgeable cultural differences. That the idea of cultural assimilation was impossible. And thus Britain was not just being swamped by immigrants, in the language of the day, but English culture and law was being transformed in the process. And for him, the Race Relations Act of 1965 was a great example of that, because it seemed to him to penalise those very people who felt that their national culture, their jobs, their houses were being taken by people from other lands. And in the middle of this speech, he gave a very famous fable about this old lady who lived on this street in his constituency in Wolverhampton, who watched her entire street being taken over by people of colour, so that she was left in a sort of in a house as a little island, feeling as though she was living in an alien land, and that her letterbox, people kept putting notes through her letterbox and even excrement through her letterbox, calling her a racialist. This was the example for Powell of how the tables had turned. Okay, you won't have to listen to this. Now, this speech was, as you can imagine, hugely contentious, and Powell was immediately sacked from his position in the shadow cabinet, and very quickly became backed by an outpouring of support on his behalf. And the London Dockers, for instance, came out on strike and marched to the House of Commons to support Powell. By 1972, he was Britain's most popular politician, with somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population claiming support for him. The Immigration Act that followed in 1971 further tightened the screws of immigration. So even though Powell is denounced, there is a growing sense that there has to be a tightening up of the immigration laws. I'll tell you about 1981 later. Now, there was, of course, counter voices to this flood of English nationalism and racism. And you can see it in two ways. The first was the continuation of this idea of a discussion about race relations that had began in 1965. In 1976, the Race Relations Act tightens up the laws against racial discrimination, both direct and indirect forms of discrimination, and sets up a new commission for racial equality to try and promote racial harmony in a whole series of different types of ways. So there's a governmental response, but there's also a popular response, which you can see in the formation of the group of musicians who form an organisation called Rock Against Racism, and another related organisation called the Anti-Nazi League. Rock Against Racism was formed in 1976 in response to some remarks, rather drunken remarks, by Eric Clapton in a television interview where he came out in support of Enoch Powell and ended up shouting the National Front slogan of "Keep Britain White." David Bowie also got himself in trouble by appearing to embrace Hitler and fascism that same year. And of course, during the punk movement, and you can see that very clearly from the Sex Pistols on that clip that I just showed there was an increasing prominence of swastikas and Nazi iconography in punk fashion. So in response to all of this, a bunch of musicians wanted to make the case that not all musicians were racial harmony. And so bands like The Clash, the Buzzcocks, the punk band The Buzzcocks, the reggae band Steel Pulse, that had Sly and Robbie in it, and Tom Robinson of Glad to Be Gay were all key figures in this. And they held a famous rally in London's Victoria Park in 1978 where 100,000 people marched from Trafalgar Square to Victoria Park, which is in the East End of London, for a concert. Okay, I'm sorry, I must move on because I get, it's like watching my youth flash behind me, flash before me. Too depressing. So let me move on to the situation in Northern Ireland. So the second way in which the United Kingdom began to fall apart was through the breakdown of the political process in Northern Ireland as in response to the civil rights movement of Catholics there. In the early 1960s, a new reforming head of the government in Northern Ireland came in, a guy called Terence O'Neill, and he begins to attempt to introduce some reforming elements. For instance, he tries to open up public housing to Catholics and even begins to talk about having a meeting with the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, which of course was hugely contentious to the Protestant majority. As you know, what this process does is actually help animate and infuse the Catholic civil rights movement with the formation of NICRA, and yet in their very famous demonstration march in Derry in 1968, the Royal Ulster Constabulary break it up very violently, and this is one of the images. This image is from that demonstration. These images are flashed around the world and are a real sign of the growing violence in Northern Ireland. In 1969, O'Neill resigns, and there are a whole series of riots that break out throughout 1968 and 1969 as Catholic civil rights campaigners clash with Protestants and with the Protestant police forces, and troops are even called in to help restore order after the so-called Battle of Bogside in Londonderry at the end of 1969. Now again, after these outbreak of violence, there were attempts to introduce further reforms. Remember, one of the things that NICRA wanted was the disbanding of the B Specials, this section of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and that actually happens in 1970. But it doesn't stop the staunch of campaigns for further reform and civil rights. It's in this context of a growing agitation that the Irish Republican Army makes a comeback. In fact, during the 1950s and the first part of the 1960s, the IRA had effectively dissipated. They'd even sold their arms to the Welsh nationalist organisation called the Free Wales Army. And there was a mural in Belfast that had famously, the IRA equals I ran away. That is to say that most of the Catholic population felt deserted by the IRA, that they had not tried to advance their interests. Nonetheless, a new provisional group of the IRA breaks away from the official IRA in 1969, and they become increasingly active in leading a terrorist, violent campaign against British rule. And indeed, the fact that they can make a connection with the civil rights movement ended up making them one of the strongest separatist terrorist organizations in Europe. Remember, Spain had ETA representing the Basque Country. There was the Red Brigade in Italy, and Baader-Meinhof in Germany, all from the late 1960s. So again, this is a pan-European process of the militarization of political conflict. The violence continues to escalate in the early 1970s and culminates with the infamous Bloody Sunday massacre on the 30th of January 1972, when British paratroopers kill 13 people involved on a civil rights march in Londonderry. This became the biggest single catalyst for the recruitment of the IRA of any single event in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Thereafter, things get nasty very, very quickly. Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister, declares direct rule on Northern Ireland, and there is what Irish Republicans would describe as a military occupation of the north, or what the British government described as an army defending the integrity of the United Kingdom. There is an attempt in 1973 and 1974 to set up a new government in Northern Ireland, a new type of assembly, but that shares power between Protestants and Catholics, and even opens up the possibility of a Council of Ireland, of the whole island of Ireland. But that falls apart after the second election in 1974, when 11 of Northern Ireland's 12 MPs were returned opposed to the development of what we would call now the peace process. In that, of course, Enoch Powell becomes an Ulster Unionist MP dedicated to the defence of the Union of the United Kingdom. And direct rule from London is returned, and the military occupation continues, and indeed stretches all the way down to the peace process of the 1990s. Indeed, one of the things that made Mrs. Thatcher's reputation when she was first elected was her position, hardline position, on the treatment of IRA political prisoners in Belfast, and the refusal of them to have a special category status as political prisoners, which culminated in the hunger strikes of 1980 and 1981, where 10 people died while on hunger strike, and Mrs. Thatcher laid out the position that you can never negotiate with terrorists. Finally, in this process, I should talk about the process of devolution in Scotland and Wales. Now, Welsh and Scottish nationalism had been around for a while. There had been a cultural revival, a cultural nationalist revival in the late 19th century and the early 20th century that culminated in the formation of two political parties, Plaid Cymru in 1925, the Welsh Nationalist Political Party, and the Scottish Nationalist Party in 1934. By 1967, Plaid Cymru had successfully agitated for a Welsh Language Act, for the restoration of the Welsh language, in Wales, which is why when you go to visit Wales now, all signs are, all traffic signs and place names are bilingual. And by the end of the 1960s, both Plaid Cymru and the Scottish Nationalist Party are beginning to win by-election victories. Indeed, by the election of 1974, they capture 30% and 10% of their national votes. But SNP gets 30% and Plaid Cymru gets 10%. And the Scottish Nationalist Party's popularity, of course, rose with the discovery of North Sea oil off the coast of Scotland in the middle of the oil crisis. So a big part of the SNP's campaign was Scottish oil for Scottish people, that Britain shouldn't be siphoning off the newfound wealth off its coast. This process culminates basically when the Labour government in the late 1970s becomes a minority government. And it becomes a minority government because it wins a very small majority in 1974, and a number of its MPs die, and there are by-elections, which means that the Scottish National Party holds the balance of power. And the Labour Party goes into an agreement with Plaid Cymru and the SNP in order to bolster the support of their government, and in return make a promise that there will be a referendum on devolution in both of those countries, which is held in 1979, is roundly defeated in Wales, not by 4 votes against 1, but in proportion 4-1, and Scotland gets 33% of the vote for the referendum, which was 40% short of 7% short of the required total. As a consequence, these two political parties withdraw their support from the Labour administration, and it's at that moment that there's a vote of no confidence against the Labour government, and that triggers the election that leads Mrs. Thatcher to power in 1979. Okay, let me move on to this next section. What I'm interested in doing here basically is showing you how new criticisms of so-called welfare capitalism emerged long before the 1970s, and how the very policies that have subsequently become associated with the arrival of Thatcherism in Britain actually preceded her and were developed by both political parties. So the first thing I want to say is that this emergence of what is often thought of as a Thatcherite critique of welfare capitalism had been around for a while. Enoch Powell, again, you can see what an important figure he is for this lecture, had during the 1960s argued that welfare capitalism and the so-called post-war consensus around the mixed economy was the cause of Britain's relative decline. It was the cause of the growth of permissive legislation, the collapse for the respect of the rule of law and authority, and the erosions of the very ancient institutions which he saw as the bedrock of British culture. Worse still, he suggested, the welfare state had removed the disciplines of poverty and unemployment that made people industrious, and it had created a new dominance of the sort of left liberal experts of the welfare state. And it was these left liberal experts who then promoted policies against racial and sexual discrimination, which for Powell further undermined the idea of individual responsibility. In short, what Powell basically wanted to do was to return the British economy to a free market system that he thought would promote personal responsibility and industry. Now, these ideas weren't just Powell's. They had come in important ways from the work of Hayek at the London School of Economics in the 1940s. And they disseminated broadly through a range of different publications and personal connections. But all of these came together in a new think tank created in 1974 called the Centre for Policy Studies, which was taken up by, in a way, Powell's successor as the sort of intellectual ideologue of the Conservative Party, Keith Joseph, Mrs. Thatcher's brains, if that's possible. And Mrs. Thatcher, indeed, becomes the deputy chairman of the Centre for Policy Studies. And its agenda is basically a duplicate of the one proposed, being developed by Powell. Again, I want to make the point that the rise to prominence of these ideas weren't just in Britain. It's not a coincidence that Hayek gets a Nobel Prize for Economics in 1974, or that Milton Friedman gets one in 1976. These aren't ideas that are limited clearly just to Britain. But I'm going to suggest key elements of them begin to be introduced in the 1970s before the election of Mrs. Thatcher. And an important figure here was Edward Heath. Edward Heath was elected as Britain's Prime Minister in 1970 at the end of Harold Wilson's administration. And he was an important figure because he was the first non-aristocratic leader of the Conservative Party. He had been educated in a grammar school. So the first non-patrician leader of the Conservative Party. Mrs. Thatcher was, of course, the second. And he embarked on a new program of modernisation, remembering countering the Labour Party, Harold Wilson's project of modernising Britain through the white heat of technology and education reform. For Heath, modernisation was going to be primarily about economic reform. And so he introduced a range of measures. He introduces decimalisation of money, and introduces a new Industrial Relations Act in 1971 to curb the powers of trade unions. He introduces local government reform in 1972. He makes Britain join the European Economic Community in 1973. And he scraps the regional development agencies that had been a vital part of economic management in the 1960s. And begins to withdraw support from so-called lame duck nationalised industries. He also introduces an incomes policy, which is probably the most important thing of all, because it tries to cap the wages of public sector wages in order to keep control of the growing rates of inflation. But his policies were not altogether successful. Inflation continued to rise. It was at 9% in 1974. Wages were growing much faster at 14% above the rate of inflation. The balance of payments deficit had grown with the deregulation of the pound. Unemployment had reached 1 million for the first time in the post-war period. And government expenditure had risen 50%. And all of this in the context of an increasingly unhappy period of industrial relations where 70 million days were lost to strikes. At the centre of that process was the National Union of Miners, who you'll remember were at the centre also of the general strike in 1926. Coal became an incredibly precious commodity in the wake of the oil crisis. Because oil had become so expensive, Britain's coal reserves were key for its energy supply. And the NUM basically resist at Heath's attempt to introduce incomes policy. So much so that they go on strike, and they force a government. They first of all forced the government to introduce the so-called 3-day week, which was when domestic users only were allowed to use power 3 days a week. So, for instance, when I was a kid, I often had to do my homework in the dark because we didn't have. There was a power cut for many, often at night, and the NUM basically brings the government to its knees, and Heath has to climb down, and the NUM are awarded a pay rise of 16%. So it was a massive, massive loss of faith by Heath, who had tried to stand up to the unions and basically lost. So in 1974, he holds an election campaign. He calls for an election with the slogan, "Who governs Britain? Is it the elected government or is it the trade union movement?" And the answer of the country was basically the trade union movement, because Heath loses power. And in came Harold Wilson again. The problem was that Harold Wilson didn't get a very big majority in the first election in 1974. So he foolishly asked for a second election to try and get a stronger majority to enable him to enact the legislation that he wanted to enact. But rather like Heath, it was a gamble that didn't pay off, because not only did the turnout of electors fall from 79 to 73%, but Labour's share of the vote fell from 38 to 36%. This left the Labour government enfeebled, basically, without the majority necessary to be able to embrace its full programme. And so, even though he came in, the Labour Party came in with the promise of scrapping his incomes policy, wages continued to rise from 15 to 23% between 1973 and 1975. Inflation went up to 25% by 1975, and Wilson is forced to reintroduce an income policy control. Wilson basically resigns in 1976, and in comes this man called James Callaghan. James Callaghan was Wilson's deputy. He becomes the Prime Minister, and he faces an awful mess to clear up. In April of 1976, the Wall Street Journal had published a piece with the title, "Goodbye Britain." The pound sterling came under unbelievable pressure, and Britain was forced to go to the IMF and beg for a loan to try and stop the economy from entirely collapsing. This was the point in which the economic policies that became known as structural adjustment that the IMF had begun to develop in the 1970s were first introduced in Britain. So in return for a loan of £3.9 billion, the Labour government was forced to introduce 20% of cuts in public expenditure. So the Labour government, dedicated to the management of the welfare state and the mixed economy, was now charged with having to follow the instructions from the IMF of slashing welfare services and watching rates of unemployment grow, peaking at 1.4 million in 1979. The trade unions were, of course, appalled by this process, and in 1978 to 1979, there was the famous winter of discontent, when public sector unions, who of course were the people who were most affected by the new pressure down on wages, went on strike. Public sector unions that were basically responsible for collecting rubbish, for running ambulances, for manning fire trucks, for driving trains, for getting people buried. In 1979, the winter of 1978 to 1979, none of that was happening. And this was what Britain looked like. You can imagine what a fun country this was to grow up in the 1970s. Just amazing stuff. It was largely on the back of this winter of discontent and this sense that basically the whole fabric of the country was falling apart that Mrs. Thatcher came to power in the election of 1979. But the point that I've been trying to make to you is that many of the policies that she became associated with had actually begun to be introduced as early as Edward Heath and anticipated in the arguments of Enoch Powell long before. And importantly, that they were also being introduced by the Labour government the Labour government, albeit a Labour government under the discipline of the IMF from 1976. Okay, so any questions on any of that? That's been a lot of material to get through, but I had to talk you through it because otherwise there's no way of understanding the craziness of nothing working. Yeah.
So part of the apathy of the electorate, the working class, was that due to sort of this winter discontent that our Labour government has let us down just as bad?
No, I think that the declining number of people coming out to elections in 1970 and in the two elections in 1974 was about, as rather like the 1930s, this widespread sense that neither of the political parties seemed to be able to address the very fundamental structural problems that had become visible in the aftermath of the breakup of the Bretton Woods system and the oil crisis of 1973. So there was a sense that Britain was facing this global economic challenge, and then it was facing all of these other quite domestic things like the breakup of the potential breakup of the United Kingdom, the debates about immigration and multiculturalism, and nobody, there was a sense that none of the political parties were really grappling with or had a clue about how to fix it. And at the same time, things continued to get worse. Inflation was spiraling. Unemployment, which had effectively disappeared for the past 3 decades, made a return. Balance of payments was crazy. It was just, economically, the country was not in great shape. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are immigration tax an existence or like a scapegoat for economic problems?
Yeah, that's an argument that is, I think, frequently made. But I think in the British context, the growth of English nationalism and racism in the late 1960s was at a time when actually the economy was in pretty good shape. The wheels, had not come off by any means, and it's really at that moment in the late 1960s that it first becomes really prominent. I think without question, as unemployment grows in the 1970s, there is new support for the racist political parties like the National Front, that does grow, and they win a famous by-election victory in 1976. But I think that it precedes the sense of the economic downturn. Okay, so let me move on to this last section of the lecture. What I've been trying to suggest to you so far, then, is that the emergence of a set of policies that we now associated with neoliberalism begin to emerge fitfully in Britain in the 1970s. Even if that's to put it too strongly, what we can certainly say for sure is that the old system of Keynesian demand management that had characterized the mixed economy and the social democratic system since the 1940s had begun to fall apart. And as I said, there was this widespread sense of not just economic crisis, but of a certain political chaos or incapacity. Now, we have to be very, very careful here, because there's no doubt that Mrs. Thatcher, like Sid Vicious and the Sex Pistols, did a great job at playing up what a profound sense of crisis there was. That is to say that I'm not trying to suggest for a moment that things were all rosy in Britain in the 1970s, but it's palpably the case that this sense of crisis was something that was inflated by the criticisms of the Conservative Party under Mrs. Thatcher and of the popular culture that surrounded young people in the late 1970s. Even if we think in terms of levels of the standards of living, even of unemployment, Britain in the late 1970s still looks not in that bad a shape. And yet in this last section of the lecture, what I want to suggest is that not only did Thatcher and punk help produce this sense of crisis as systemic, as a structural problem, but that in many ways their responses to it were remarkably similar. That there was the same emphasis on having to destroy the system, sometimes on destroying it violently or authoritarianly, and to produce that everything would have to fall apart before it could be put back together. So let me begin with punk. Punk was many, many different things, but I think that we can understand it as a response to this political and economic crisis, to an idea that there really was anarchy in the UK, and the only possible reasonable response to that would be an embrace of anarchism. This is why the Sex Pistols were so fond of shouting out things like, no future, and all of the other things that you heard them shouting, all the other obscenities that you heard them shouting at the beginning of this class. Punk, and not just the Sex Pistols, I think, shared a similar critique of the social democratic system, as we'll see with Mrs. Thatcher. They were certainly critical of the welfare state, the idea that emancipation could come through a system of welfare capitalism was something that it was profoundly opposed to, and the very way of life, the very structured and sort of way of life that meant for many people was something that it abhorred. There was also, I think, the widespread sense in the punk movement that affluence, the so-called affluence that their parents had grown up in, was going away, and in any case material goods would not lead to any type of emancipation. There's no surprise in that sense that punk was all about wearing clothes that were hanging by threads. It was a display, a conspicuous display of clothing as shredded, and as worse than being poor. If you're poor, you care about how you look. And of course, it was a criticism of all that horrible hippie stuff and all the embrace of alternative lifestyles that I talked about on Tuesday. It's sometimes claimed that the punk movement represented a white riot, just as in the words of the famous Clash song, and that what we see in the punk movement was a revolt of the white male working class. I think we have to be a little careful about this argument. First of all, even though punk was characterized by a very masculine style, women were actually pretty central both to its style and to the practice of music. So one of my favorite bands at this time was Susie and the Banshees. The Slits was one of the first all-women bands. All-women bands hadn't really existed before then. And Vivienne Westwood, the clothes designer, arguably did more than anyone else to establish the very look of punk. So it's hard, I think, to ignore the role of women in the punk movement. Also, I think we have to be careful of branding punk simply a racist movement. It's clear that there were important forms of racism that emerge out of punk, particularly with skinhead culture that emerges in the post-punk era. We shouldn't, I think, mistake the punk use of fascist icons as being simply a sign of a lurking racism. They were designed to shock and to appall, not to, I think, be associated with a particular political platform. And as the Clash made abundantly clear, much of punk was actually deeply inspired by black music and by reggae in particular. Finally, I think we also have to acknowledge that there was a very transatlantic nature of punk. That punk didn't just come out of the chaos of Britain in the 1970s, that it also came out particularly from the sort of New York music scene, of the New York Dolls, of Iggy Pop, of the Ramones. All of these bands, I think, in important ways, began to anticipate some of the styles of music and the forms of performance that punk in Britain became associated, even though I think punk in Britain took them several steps further. Arguably, one of the most important elements of punk culture was its so-called DIY culture. The fact that you didn't have to be able to know how to play an instrument, as the Sex Pistols famously demonstrated. Okay? It was just about picking up a guitar and playing it. It was just about putting together any type of clothing, slashing it, sticking it together with pins and chains. Anyone could be their own fashion designer. Anyone could be their own, could set up a band and become a musician. Indeed, this was directly opposed to the so-called commercialization of youth that had gathered apace since the 1950s, when young people were meant to just simply buy the music and the clothes that were commercially aimed at it. For this reasons that, of course, the Sex Pistols used to sing about the great rock and roll swindle. They were doing supposedly something quite different. What I'm suggesting here is that punk promotes an idea of individual expression that looks not very dissimilar to the same emphasis upon individual fulfillment, both of hippie culture and of the sense of personal responsibility that was being promoted by Enoch Powell and Mrs. Thatcher. And finally, let's get to her at last. So what I'm saying here is that it's no coincidence that the Sex Pistols and Mrs. Thatcher both came to prominence in 1976. They didn't just come out of the same conditions, out of the same historical moment. They also shared really key features. When the Sex Pistols were singing about no future, Mrs. Thatcher was talking about the decline of Great Britain and how Britain would have no future unless it would grapple with the problems that she thought were structural to welfare capitalism and consensus politics. Indeed, what Mrs. Thatcher promoted was a turn away from consensus politics, of government through consensus, that everybody agreed around the mixed economy and the welfare state. She said, no, this has to change. We need someone to break the mold, and I am the person to be able to do it. There's also, of course, their shared hatred of the 1960s, but for slightly different reasons. One of Mrs. Thatcher's closest confidants was a man called Norman Tebbit, and he described the 1960s as that insufferable, smug, sanctimonious, naive, guilty, wet, pink orthodoxy of the sunset home and a third-rate decade. Couldn't really get a bigger condemnation of the 1960s, but I think it's one that would have been shared by many people who embraced punk music. Clearly, Mrs. Thatcher was deeply critical of welfare capitalism, of the idea that capitalism should be organized around the service of a socially democratic system with welfare for all. This was what she thought made Britain's economy uncompetitive. Just as that system promised protection from cradle to grave, promised careers that would begin after school and last for life, that this was the type of closet or the sense of a lifelong imprisonment that punk wanted to revolt against. So Mrs. Thatcher, of course, wanted a much more flexible labour market, wanted, in a sense, to break up the forms of regulation that created those life patterns for many people during the post-war era. And finally, of course, Mrs. Thatcher was firmly opposed to immigration, firmly opposed to the idea of multiculturalism that was being promoted after the creation of the Commission for Racial Equality in 1976. One of the very first things that Mrs. Thatcher does in 1981 is to bring in the most exclusive or the most draconian immigration law ever introduced in Britain in 1981. Here, I think you can see that Mrs. Thatcher absolutely plays up to the forms of white racism that had emerged around Enoch Powell and the protests of the late 60s and early 70s. I think the key difference between Thatcher and punk, though, is that whereas punk thought the solution to all of this was the embrace of anarchy, or at least certain sections of the punk movement thought that the response to this was an embrace of anarchy, Mrs. Thatcher thought that actually the opposite was required, that what actually was needed was a new type of leadership, a new type of what she would recognize was an authoritarian leadership. It required a single person to break the mold, and break the mold so that Britain could be remade. And with that authoritarianism, as we'll see next week, came an insistence on the return to certain key moral values that she felt the 1960s had desecrated, which would have been profoundly different to those that the punk movement would have celebrated. So Mrs. Thatcher really was a punk, and you heard that here first. Okay, let me wrap this up. You'll remember that the arc of this class has been about this sequence, albeit this overlapping sequence, of a transition from the ancien regime to liberalism, to social democracy, to then something that I'll talk about, I'm beginning to talk about today, but I'll talk about more on Tuesday, as neoliberalism. Okay? And what I've been suggesting in each of those, in each of these stages of the class, what I've been trying to say is, look, these are the characteristic features of these political and economic systems. But we have to recognize the way in which one always bleeds into the other. There isn't simply a revolutionary rupture where one gives way to the other. They always remain, in some sense, embedded in each other. Nonetheless, I've been trying to say for the last few weeks, since you all came back from Cancun, was that social democracy took an identifiably very, very different type of form between the 1940s through to the 1970s and even perhaps the 1980s. And yet the key issue that you need to grasp for this series of lectures and for the one that will come on Tuesday is why it, despite its success at promoting the standards of living of people in Britain, of transforming the infrastructure of that country in so many ways, why it became so vulnerable to criticism and why it began to be dismantled so quickly from the 1970s through to the 1990s. And I've given you a series of answers to that question. The first is, I have been suggesting to you that it was a victim of its own success, that in a certain way it was based around the idea of the emancipation of a traditional working class, that in many ways it succeeded in emancipation. And it was left instead trying to deal with people's aspirations and desires for some other form of fulfillment. Another important weakness of the social democratic system was that it always claimed to represent society as a whole, and yet it continued to do so in ways that created a particular view of the family, of gender relations, of the whiteness of the nation, and of generation, of the role of different generations. And that critically, one of the key things about those, the other weakness of those promises of a sort of universal welfare was that it never quite succeeded in building the infrastructures and providing, funding the very forms of welfare that it had promised. Another key feature that I've been talking about, and this is absolutely vital to Mrs. Thatcher's critique of social democracy, is that it was the creation of the new technocratic intellectual aristocracy, that it was a revolution for the people, not by the people, that this was something imposed upon them, as Mrs. Thatcher would have argued, and that the first thing that was required was therefore to strip away welfare professionals like teachers and doctors and social workers, the forms of authority and autonomy that they had been given under that system. Finally, what I've been saying is that one of the key elements of this, of the structural weakness of social democracy, is that it existed at a time where Britain's economy was being transformed by forces beyond its control. That is, by the process of decolonisation and by the increasing globalisation of the economy in the wake of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the rise of new deregulated flows of finance and of trade. And finally, what I've been trying to say is that the labour movement goes from being seen as the bedrock of the country, as it was in that film, The Heart of Britain, I showed you during the Second World War, where it was the workers who were the foundation of the country who needed to be, whose interests needed to be promoted and secured, to, by the 1970s, the labour movement and the trade unions being seen as the very people that were holding the country to ransom with their inflated wage demands and their policies of striking and bringing down governments. Okay? This was a very, very important shift. And of course, one of the very first things that the Thatcher administrations do, as we'll see, culminated with yet another strike by the miners in 1983 and 1984, is the attempt to remove the power of the unions. Very important development. But I'll leave that for you on Tuesday.